Dana, and thank you all for joining us this morning. And thank you to the School of Visual Arts for its support of today's Anderson Lecture presented in conjunction with the Global Asia's exhibition, which is on view at the Palmer Museum of Art through December 12th. I'm Joyce Robinson, Assistant Director of the Palmer, and it has been my great pleasure to work with Dr. Chang Tan and the Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation on this exciting project. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Jacob Hashimoto, who indeed is one of the stars of the exhibition and who figures prominently in the exhibition catalog as one of only 3 artists selected to be interviewed by the collector. Jacob Hashimoto's work is difficult to pigeonhole. He is a sculptor, painter, and installation artist who creates immersive installations that are technically dazzling and culturally complex. As Global Asia's confirms, he is also an inventive printmaker who has worked with Mixographia and Durham Press to create mind-boggling tour de force prints that defy easy categorization. And I will tell you that confound curators working primarily from digital files. A constant in his work is his creation of complex worlds using a range of modular components, including bamboo and paper kites and model boats, and as in the case of the Hashimoto Index, which you see here, woodblock prints based on digital designs inspired by physical objects. His accretive layered compositions reference video games, virtual environments, and cosmology, while also remaining deeply rooted in art historical traditions, notably landscape-based abstraction, modernism, and handcraft. Raised in the Pacific Northwest, Jacob is a graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and currently lives and works just outside New York City. His work has been featured in museum exhibitions across the United States and Europe. He has also had solo gallery shows at Mary Boone Gallery in New York, Rona Hoffman Gallery in Chicago, Anglin Gilbert Gallery in San Francisco, Studio La Città in Verona, and Gallery Force Bloom in Helsinki, among others. So I'm delighted to welcome Jacob. And before I hand it over, I am going to ask you please to feel free to enter questions into the Q&A feature, and we will have questions at the end. We'll save time for that. So please join me in welcoming Jacob Hashimoto.
Thanks, Joyce. I guess I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see how this, oops. The host is disabled participant screen sharing. It says. There we go. And share that. And play. So first, I'd like to thank Joyce and the Palmer Museum of Art for inviting me to share my work. I'd also like to thank Sydney Mullis and Dana Hosko and Sarah Hoover for working so hard to get me here on this little screen. I submitted the title for this talk a few months back with some different notions in mind than what we'll be dealing with today, but I think it'll still work. The fundamental parts remain true. They remain the same: space, object, and image. They're the cornerstones of everything that I do. I'd like to get started with a passage from a book by art historian and media studies scholar Anne Freeberg. The book was titled The Virtual Window from Alberti to Microsoft, and it traced the idea of the window from the Renaissance through modernist architecture to the screens of the digital age. In his 1435 treatise on painting in perspective, Di Pittura, Leon Battista Alberti instructed painters to, quote, regard the rectangular frame of the painting as an open window, aperta finestra. Alberti's Renaissance metaphor of the window has haunted centuries of subsequent thinking about the humanist subject of perspective and has remained a defining concept for theories of painting, architecture, and moving image media. Unlike the metaphor of the window as a frame for perspectival view, the metaphor of the window in computer software relies on a different set of assumptions. An early component of the graphical user interface, the computer, quote, window, referred not to the full expanse of the computer screen, but rather to a subset of its screen surface, an inset screen within the screen of the computer. One of many nested on its, quote, desktop, the computer window shifts its metaphorical hold from the singular frame of perspective to the multiplicity of windows within windows, frames within frames, and screens within screens. When Freeberg wrote this passage all the way back in 2006, so quite a while ago, the world was clearly a very different place. But I think that her observations about the metaphor of the window are still really resonant today. Clearly, a lot has happened in the interim, but the notion of the window as a fundamental metaphorical mechanism is as relevant today as it ever has been. Even now, the frame extends itself to layers, pages, embedded links, and on and on. Freeberg goes on to quote Alberti's own technical description of what he was specifically up to with this notion of window. I'll quote it here because it's actually kind of interesting. I draw a rectangle of whatever size I want, which I regard as an open window through which the subject painted is seen, and I decide how large I wish the human figure is in the painting to be. I divide the height of this man into 3 parts. With this measure, I divide the bottom line of my rectangle into as many parts as it will hold. And this bottom line of the rectangle for me is proportional to the next transverse equidistant quantity seen on the pavement. Then I establish a point on the rectangle wherever I wish as it occupies the place where the centric ray strikes. I shall call this the centric point, and it goes on from there. And I actually cut a chunk out of the middle. In this paragraph, Alberti's really outlining a formula for perspective painting that's, involves a variable rectangular frame, a window as a metaphor, the subject that is seen through this frame, the human figure as a standard of measure. So he's measuring all of the stuff off the human body as the centric point, and the immobility of the viewer. What I'm most interested in is this notion of the immobility of the viewer alongside the primacy of this kind of human-based centric point, as I see it as really the limiting factor of this model of representation. Freeberg goes on to explain how this limit was subsequently challenged by other artists through the introduction of pictorial devices. And my sense is that the fundamental limited formulaic purity of Alberti's model is illustrated by the necessary introduction, mostly by others, of these elements. These modifications allowed an otherwise narrow working method to better address the narrative complexity that had been lost through its introduction. It allowed Alberti's system to function in the world effectively, and it actually allowed it to be useful. And even as I see the flaw in this limited single point perspective model, the absolutism of the single point perspective at any given moment and position is telling, and it's important. It tells us something about our condition, our place in the world, and our place in the world of constant change. This is Donald Judd. And this is a piece of mine. This idea of changeability and transformation is so fundamental, not just in regards to Windows, but in regards in terms of the ways in which we all consider visual language over time. I often ask myself, well, not often, but sometimes ask myself, how does art and visual language change over time in political context? How do new models of thinking become old and flawed over time and fashion? How does technology and information and retrospection transform the meaning of art over time? How are absolutes useful in understanding change and context in the world? How are limits useful? The Buddha contends that all is change and all is flux. The world is afflicted by death and decay, but the wise do not grieve, having realized the nature of the world. That's fair enough. And certainly material changes in artwork are inevitable. We should all know this by now. This is old Fluxus news and truly a frustrating studio reality for a lot of us. But and John Cage maybe said it best when he said, you say the real world as it is, but it is not. It becomes, it moves, it changes. It doesn't wait for us to change. It is more mobile than you can imagine. You're getting closer to this reality when you say it, quote, presents itself, that it means that it is not there, existing as an object. The world, the real, is not an object. It is a process. Dieter Roth, I suspect Dieter Roth would agree. He made a series of these pieces called pocket rooms, which are amazing. And he made each of these by pressing a banana slice into a card stamped with a picture of a table. And then he put the whole thing into a playing card box and sealed them up. And of course, the fruit turns moldy, rots, and the chaos emerges out of each instance of decay. And while there are multiples, like of the prints in the show, all of these were completely different because they change, because of a random series of factors based on one essential given. When I was looking for this stuff, I was actually looking for a decaying piece as a Fluxus example that involved these carrots nailed to plinths and walls. And I'd forgotten the name of the artist because it was a piece that I saw during the Walker exhibition of Fluxus art in the 90s. So it's quite a while ago. And I just kept running into bananas and carrots. And they're certainly less interesting than that stuff. So it's best to go back to Fluxus, I think. Where's the possibility in all of this? How is constant change and contextual transformation useful? The fact is that we all create models. We build them, we destroy them, we learn from them, we discard them. Others come along and pick up old useful parts of them, dust them off, use them for their own purposes. In general, we see how our collective purpose that drives our collective knowledge. This engine moves forward. We can find new meanings in old language and practice through practice. These kinds of artist talks are always an interesting and kind of frustrating exercise in remembering an invention. You're looking back on bodies of work in your distant past and recent past from a fixed perspective, and it's certainly curious. I find that every time I revisit old work, its meaning has changed in my mind. It's not what it was and not how I remembered it. I often think about who I was and where I was and what I was thinking about when I was making the early work, but we all know the tricks of the mind and memory are infinite and oceanic, and the truth of those thoughts should be suspect. What I'm left with is the work viewed from today from this fixed point, this fixed perspective. As we know from Alberti, it's useful. It's a useful perspective, but it's flawed. On one side of things, we have a fixed perspective, Alberti, the Renaissance, which is foundational, especially to Western art history, but it's limited. On the other side of things, we have this wonky, strange perspectival system of the digital world. How do our eyes incorporate the multiplicity of photo perspectives that you see when you quickly scroll through an Instagram feed? How do they digest the inbox of your mailbox or your email box? Or how do we build a world from a video game when you're sometimes staring at the bird's eye view of a steady room as the character walks around inside it, and then suddenly the room starts scrolling and the character becomes a fixed point of stability? How do our brains deal with a Zoom room we're looking at between 1 and 49 full-faced images of each other with 10 distinct vanishing points behind us? Are windows and viewfinders and apertures growing less and less consequential? Are they no longer the essential way that we see blocks of visual information? In the digital age, we're habituating to overlapping, colliding, and simultaneously existing layers, like the 50,000 browser windows open on my screen right now. These are some of the questions I think about when I'm making artwork. How do you navigate this territory? How do you make it your own? How do you find your own identity in this forest of windows? When I began making what I call the kite work in 1994 or 1995, I was still a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And what I'm going to show you here is the actual very first piece, because a lot of what's in the show at the Palmer relates to this piece as well. It's kind of useful to have. This was in 1996. and I was a painting student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And at the time, I was making some really terrible paintings. I'll get to this slide, I guess. And I was making these really terrible sort of field paintings. You know, it was a landscape-based abstraction, but in the most kind of banal, common vocabulary you can imagine. You know, these big empty voids of, you know, early 20-something misery. And they're just embarrassing, actually, when I think about it. But I had gone through the interim winter session at the school, and it was this point where I was entering my last year. And I think as a lot of students, especially, you know, graduate students, thinking back to their undergraduate moment, and current seniors in art programs always feel this sense of kind of wanting to create their own identity and like have their own voice within these incredibly narrow fields. You know, the more you learn about painting, the fewer things you can do, and the more you learn about anything, it seems like it's trapping you. And so, facing this kind of common problem, I started building kites to fly in the park across the street, because at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, it's right downtown, and across the street is Grant Park, which is this big park where you can, you know, kind of do whatever you want. I mean, the art schools, like especially undergraduate at SAIC, is pretty mellow sometimes. So I was building a lot of kites and flying them. And I looked up one day, and I all thumbtacked them with the wall of my studio, because I was building the same kite over and over. And I looked up at this wall of kites one day, and I thought, you know, I could totally do something with these. At the time, you have to understand that there were this painting sculpture dialectic was still in play. It seems like a quaint notion today when we think about it, but it was really kind of an important thing for us to be contending with, and especially as painting students. And so this coming out of kind of Greenbergian modernism, you know, there was a sense that you still had to contend with some unsolved problems there if you were working in abstraction. And people like Jessica Stockholder and Ann Hamilton were starting to do like really large scale installation work, you know, that talked about, you know, sculpture, but it also talked about painting spaces, and it talked about the relationship of these spaces to architecture. And my notion is that I could take these kite objects and explode them into room-sized sculptures that allowed me to address some of those things that I was interested in through the field paintings that I was making. And so I left school with this one piece finished, and I had never shown it. And I left and started making a sculpture in my studio, or in the little garret apartment I lived at on the north side of Chicago. And because I come from a background of print, I'd made a whole bunch of prints. And if you guys know anything about printmaking, you know that you end up with a ton of material at the end. And if you're not editioning things, it's really a problem. I took offset productions and made a whole bunch of offset prints. And so when I left school, I had this stack of paper that I didn't know what to do with. And I started building kites out of it. And I built these Japanese kites. And these were each of them has a little cloud print on it. And at the time, I had this job with Ann Nathan Gallery in Chicago, which was an outsider art gallery. And I was the preparator in the back room, and for a year, I'd been building this sculpture upstairs in my little garret apartment, and I didn't know how to install it, and I had it installed through room after room after room of my house, all the way through from the front door to the kitchen and to all the way to the back door. And so I was entering and exiting the apartment through the fire escape, and I bagged the whole thing up and took it on a train with my friend John Landaway, and we took it down to the gallery, and on Thanksgiving, Anne let me install it just temporarily for a week. And so we left it there, and Anne snuck in on a Sunday, and she saw it, and she said, you know, that's a really nice piece. Why don't you leave it up? And so we left it up, and the curator for the Museum of Contemporary Art came in the week later and saw it, and he asked me if I could make another piece for them. And so the original piece was 10,000 kites. And it was supposed to kind of be this play on this notion of infinity, you know, this idea that in ancient cultures, if you use numbers, like big enough numbers, they mean, you know, infinity. So it's like 1,000, 10,000. And so when the museum came to me to ask me to do this project, they were like, well, how much space can that take up? And I was like, not very much, because the original piece was 15 by 15 feet. And I said, we're going to have to expand it. And so we ended up building 10,000 pieces. So it's this notion, and the piece is called an infinite expansive sky because it's this notion of like in the ancient world, if you have like 10,000 of something, you may as well have an infinite number. Or also, if you play with old enough rules, you too can be God, I think was the idea. But I ended up moving to my parents' house in Walla Walla, Washington, and building this in their basement. It's 100 feet long by 30 feet high, by 30 feet wide. And obviously we jumped to 2014, but between making the infinite expansive sky sculpture and today, and 2014, obviously there's a lot of connective tissue that we're jumping over. I've spent many years making lots of large scale installations in different places. But I think for the interest of time, because I really want to talk about new work, we're going to scream through a little bit of this stuff. So LA Mocha, years later, offered me a show. And this is at a point where they still had this space called the Pacific Design Center, which was a museum space in near Century City in Los Angeles. And they had seen this piece, the curator had seen this piece at the Corini Stampaglia during the Venice Biennale the year before, and came to me and asked me if I could make it bigger again and put it in their museum space. And kind of like thinking about the space, it was this giant cube, and you kind of come in on the first floor and there's a 40 by 40 foot gallery. And I decided that as you entered this space, I really wanted you to feel like you were in this kind of black and white moonscape. So you open the door to this gallery and you see this kind of billowing architectural size like environment. And that went wall to wall, floor to ceiling. And we came in with a crew of about 12 people over 6 weeks, half of us from New York, half from Los Angeles. And we put up 50,000 elements, these kite elements. But the kites themselves were actually built over, a decade of work. I think the earliest pieces were built in the 90s, and then I kept adding and adding and adding components to it. So in this picture, for example, we're seeing pieces that we made, the tangled pieces we made especially for this exhibition. The ellipses were made for a show at Macro, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Rome. The elliptic, or the ones with the little pill shapes, were made specifically for this work. We made a lot of pieces on the ground floor because they didn't have a lot of black and white works for this. And then as you walk upstairs, the whole thing kind of travels from the first floor into the stairwell and then up the stairs of the museum. And you emerge into the second floor space, which is like 50 by 50 feet. And usually when I show this piece, we show this chunk of video with it because it helps to explain kind of the nature of like what it feels like to be in that room. But I've been told that the video is not working super well on these speeds, so we skipped that today. But when you walk upstairs, it kind of, from this kind of real denuded space downstairs, it kind of emerged in this Technicolor kind of blinding space. And the room's 50 by 50 feet, but it's also 37 feet tall. So when you walk to the center of the room, there's a bunch of skylights that come up, and you can see they're casting light straight down through the piece. The other thing I should mention is this work kind of was developed in stages. It originally started as this piece called The Other Sun, which was built for a show in London. And it was an interesting moment because I built it because I was playing Minecraft at the time, and everybody plays Minecraft today, but at the time it was like 2010. So it was still this kind of weird little game that used to get off the internet from some Swedish server. My dad had talked to me about it because he's a professor and his students were playing it. And it was this odd little quirky thing. So I built this little sculpture out of kites. I was, because I saw the language that I was already using kind of evidenced in this work. Because, the XYZ coordinate system that I've been using, since the 90s, people have used for millennia, but we start seeing it evidenced more and more and more in our everyday life, Minecraft being one of those examples. It's And that XYZ coordinate, I'm just going to say one more kind of tedious thing about it. It's interesting when you think about landscape, because the way that landscapes are built these days, digital landscapes and video games, and CGI when you watch movies, is all in this XYZ coordinate system. So it's really the fabric of kind of contemporary modes of world creation. And I saw this way of taking this kind of analog system that I've been working with and starting to mimic some of those structures that I was seeing in video games, and building larger and larger sorts of XYZ coordinate system environments that were kind of like these analog versions of digital spaces. And you see this. Here you can see on the left or on the right hand side, there's it was like a giant cube built out of an infinite expanse of sky, but you can see how small that is relative to the rest of the work that's in here. And this is a section stretching up into the ceiling. You can see how it opens up. What happened here was interesting, because we'd been there for about 3 weeks installing, and we got into this center section of the room, and we had scissor lifts that went straight up all the way up to the top. And we'd been working up there in this kind of like solar furnace, because there's no air conditioning, for 12 days or something. And then a couple of my assistants flew home, and I had been riding my bike into the museum to work, and I got there and I was taking off my cycling shoes on the second floor, and I looked up. I was like, something's weird up there. And I looked up, and half of this piece had kind of swung down, had torn out of the wall and fallen to the ground. And so half of it was just draped across the room. And it looked pretty cool, actually, but it was really terrifying too, because we had another 3 weeks. I think it must have been a little bit later. We had about 3 weeks left. I was concerned about finishing. And so we ended up having to figure out a way that we could hoist this piece back up and re-anchor it in the wall, because it took out like toggle anchors out of the sheetrock and left like 1.5 inches in like holes through the wall. And it was a little touch and go for a while, but we figured it out. It's kind of one of those things when you work large scale, you're always kind of facing disasters. In fact, one of the talks that I give some time about my work is just kind of stories about how things went wrong, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want. But when all of these pieces are done, the infinite expanse of sky, all those little pieces I showed, perennial, then this piece, all 50,000 pieces are cut apart. So we just go to it with scissors, because none of this stuff is movable. And I think that it's, with the early work was kind of a really important part of the work, was that it was not permanent, that it didn't exist outside of the exhibition in the way that it doesn't exist outside the exhibition ever in that particular way again. And oftentimes, we'll take the same artwork and we'll travel it from location to location to location, and it will change over different architectures. So there was a piece that started in Sweden and moved to, or it started in Texas and moved to Sweden and moved to Venice and moved to like a set on the Warner Brothers lot for an Ocean's 13 movie. So all that stuff happens too. And it's really fundamental to kind of the character of the artwork. This is another one of those pieces that doesn't move. So in 2018, I made a piece called the Eclipse. And it was, right after the election. Well, this version of it's 2018, but the original version was actually in 2017. And it was originally built for the Palazzo show at the Palazzo Flangini in Venice during the 2017 Biennale. And it was a moment where, we had set up this show a year in advance, like before the election of 2016. I'm going to show some of my politics here, but there was a moment kind of after the election where we're trying to figure out what we were going to do with this show, because I was sad, and I felt like we were going to, and I felt like Europe was sad. Everybody was kind of in shock about what was going on, as we can all remember. And there was this moment where, I was faced with a decision about how to build an artwork for a public exhibition with a huge number of international visitors as an American artist in this moment. And as an American artist who's kind of like well known for making real technicolor, joyful, utopian sort of landscape work. And it was a challenge to think about how to address this exhibition in Venice, knowing that, I was in some ways representing myself and my friends and the people that work in the studio, and how we were feeling at that moment. So we had this stack of old black paper around, and we started experimenting on it with silkscreen printing, and we ended up silkscreen printing a full-size American flag on all these sheets of paper, kind of fractured across them. And then we took the paper and we put them on these 9-inch circular kites, and installed them in the sculpture. And so you can see in this image, the reason I'm sitting on this image a little bit is it's the best image to kind of see how those kites are refracting light. And so as you walked under the piece, even though the flag wasn't super visible from a distance, it starts appearing and disappearing. And the original configuration for this was like a tornado that kind of came from the Grand Canal and spun up into the sky. And this is the version that we did on Governor's Island, which I think is probably the most successful. You can get a sense of the scale. So this is in this church called St. Cornelius, and it's owned by Trinity Cathedral. It's part of their parish. And it's not decommissioned, but it's not currently in use by the parish. And for those of you who don't know, Governor's Island is this island south of Manhattan, and it's this island that was owned by the federal government for a long time. And there's like an old fortress on the island. There's a prison on the island where prisoners of war were kept during, like, after the Civil War. And it's apparently full of ghosts. But they have this kind of lovely public art project where they invite artists to come and do site-specific projects in their spaces. So they have, all the old houses and the buildings and the fortresses are open to use if you can figure out how to use them in ways that, will get approval from the Parks Department, for example. So they came to us and we walked around campus, this island, and found this church, and it's this old terracotta church. And the building's landmarked. And it's got these incredible, old growth beams in it. And it's kind of space that you don't really find, in the States very often. But because it's landmarked, we actually had to put together these boards with all our hooks and stuff on them, and like strap them to the beams and figure out how to retrofit this building without actually putting any fasteners in. So you can see here, if you look on the top of that beam, there's a series of boards that we've lashed to the structure. And then from that, we're hanging all the pieces. And it's about 10,000 pieces altogether, 12,000, I guess, in this version. And you can see the stars. This is actually shot from where I'm working as I'm installing the piece. You can see down to the stained glass windows. And when we were done, obviously, you couldn't see this because we're really working right at the ceiling level. And the thing is about these pieces too is, this piece is now back in the studio because we cut it down as well, because, obviously you can't transport it. And now it has to get repaired, and we'll probably send it out again in some other configuration later. But they come home and they get taken care of and they go back out. And it's this kind of life cycle of these objects. And it might turn into part of Gas Giant at some point as well. This is from straight underneath the artwork. So it took 3 of us, I think, like 2 weeks to put this up after the cables were put up. But at the same time, we were working on another space on the island, putting up a giant kind of lenticular sculpture that stayed outside. It was kind of like this black hole sculpture that joined the 2 sides of the island. But it was less successful than this, so I left it out. What was interesting is that the guys that were working on the other sculpture were construction workers, because it was elevated. It was like an architectural thing. And they came over to look at this because they knew that we'd been working on it. And it took them a second because they were like, one of them looked at me and said, "Is that an American flag on that sculpture?" that thing? And we were like, "Yeah." And they looked at us. And nobody said anything. And it was this moment that was kind of my greatest fear with this, was bringing it back to the States and having it seen by Americans, seen by especially like a broad range of New Yorkers, because my work just typically isn't very political. And I think that it's scary if you're not an overtly political artist to kind of get involved in any kind of statement that kind of goes outside of your comfort zone. But I found it really gratifying because I think that, those guys knew us, the people, the men and women working on that crew, and they had a relationship with us that kind of gave them a different sensibility about the work than they might have had otherwise. And in Governor's Island, if any of you ever get a chance to do a project there, I think it's really worth doing, because it's this kind of amazing space where your artwork is treated really with a great amount of respect by the curators, but also exposed to like a gigantic number of people that would normally not ever encounter work. And I think that we as a studio found it really gratifying to go in there and do those projects. So in addition to the kind of temporary artwork that we do with the canopy, and I say we a lot because my staff, I work with a staff of 10, some in admin, but about 7 people like doing collage work and things like that. So at the same time we're doing that work, we're also doing, or the impermanent work that the studio keeps, we're also doing a good amount of public artwork. And I just put in one example of it today. And this is a project that we did at PDX. I put it in because it's interesting. PDX is the Portland airport. And it's interesting because it shows kind of how the language of gas giant translates into kind of more permanent pieces or public spaces. And so oftentimes, we'll get requests from municipalities to participate in juried competitions or whatever to be commissioned for artworks. And PDX, while they have a public RFQ, usually these things, they'll ask other artists who they think might be good for it to submit proposals. And so they can reach out to us and ask us to propose sculptures for their new concourse E at the airport. And what happens is that, you go in and you get shortlisted for this thing, and then you compete against, like head to head against like 4 to 5, I guess usually about 5 other teams or artists in order to get these projects. And we went in with this idea, I went in with this idea that we needed to figure out a way to take the language of gas giant, which is this thing that was just made for art's sake, and move it into a public space, and then be able to define to the people that we're working with why we're doing that and what it means and what the components are that reflect the the values and the kind of ethos they're trying to convey to their patrons, without losing kind of the soul of the work. So here we built these, they asked us to do these 2 artworks. One's called The City and one's called The Sky, in 2 different nodes of the concourse. And the first one that we're looking at here is The City. And it looks a lot like gas giant, but if you actually look at it from above, it's shaped like the city of Portland at this moment. And as we know from like living in the world, cities' boundaries change all the time. But so the specific map shape of the city of Portland at this moment becomes almost a timestamp for the artwork. And so based on the city map, Portland's a city of rivers. So we have these series of rivers that run through the piece at different elevations, and they connect to each other, creating this kind of cube depth map of Portland. And every neighborhood in the city, we designed different graphics that kind of reflected the character of the neighborhood using kind of our own language. And these are made out of resin and bamboo. They're what we do essentially is we take the pieces that we were making out of paper, and we scan them, and we digitally trace them and turn them into vector files. We take those vector files and we have them printed onto rice paper, and then those prints are embedded in these frames of resin that look like kites, but they're actually resin. They're actually a urethane resin, and so this piece is made the same way. It's actually exactly the same shape as the first piece, but it's called The Sky. And so clearly it's a sculpture of the sky. And so also with these pieces, you have to look on the sides. There's these ventilation shafts that go back into the building. And so, airports are super well ventilated, and these And we have to work with like HVAC engineers, lighting engineers, architects, structural engineers, all of those people to kind of realize these projects. And this piece also has to be cleanable and removable. So each one of these hangs on a fiberglass rod that goes into the ceiling, and we built custom hardware to kind of attach everything. Because there's also a bunch of fire codes that we deal with. You can get a sense of the scale. And because this all happened during COVID, the process of proposing the artwork happened a year before. And so we were already heavily into production by, January of 2020. And, we're getting all of our parts made and all our pieces put together. And we had to go, I think, in March, and we went out and we had to put all of our connection points in the ceiling. And then we came home and we weren't traveling anymore. But essential construction kept going on. And in Portland, like airports are essential construction. And so we ended up having to send a team out in the middle of, I think, May of last year. And they spent about 6 weeks on site just installing, kind of with masks and headgear, and everything, all the protective equipment that they needed. And it was a terrible experience for everybody, but I think the pieces are actually quite beautiful. So these are the current projects that I'm working on. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So everything that we make, for the most part, out of the studio is made out of cut paper. This is my desk. It also looks like I was painting a bicycle fork. And the paper that we use is really specific. For years and years, I used kind of commercially available papers like Japanese papers, Thai papers, Chinese papers, Indian papers, any kind of dyed colored papers. What happened is about 10 years into the practice, we started seeing pieces coming back to us that had a lot of color loss. It was weird color loss. So you'd lose just like one color out of the whole thing. And so I started working with a paper mill in Japan to make this paper. And so when we're looking at a piece like this, all the pattern that you see is cut paper. And we're using, mechanical means of cutting, digital cutters, hand cutting, anything you can imagine we're doing here. And this piece is actually called Methuselah, and it's named after the tree in like the desert Southwest that's considered the oldest tree in the world. And so the top section is a pattern that's made out of the cellular pattern of the tree, of the cells. And then we take that, we turn it into a vector file, and then we kind of manipulate it into these patterns, these panels of patterns that then we cut up. And then underneath it is a pattern kind of made from the potato blight, which is from the Irish potato famine, famously of the potato famine. This was made for a show that in Helsinki. Also the works for the Ford went to Helsinki for an exhibition. This is a detail. So every little piece is hand cut paper. And the only things that we do is we do sometimes paint the backs. Like for example, these are painted in the backs and it helps pop the color a little bit. This show at Roncchini Gallery, it's the same gallery where I showed the original version of The Other Sun. And this show is called In This Time and Space. And it opened last week, I think last week. And here's an installation view. And I didn't go because none of us are really traveling for exhibitions, but it's a series of wall works based around a few different themes. I mean, one of them is kind of repetition of motif and like architectural screens, and another is landscape and abstraction, which is kind of the cornerstone of everything that I do. And these small works, there's 5 of them, and they're kind of intended to function more like friezes, more like panels in a frieze, but not like windows, but they're more like gargoyles, so they're truly objects in space, and they exist outside of a single point perspective, even though, they were made from a single point perspective. This piece is called In This Time and Place. And it's about 5.5 by 5 feet. And you can see there's a leaf pattern that I drew, and then we create this kind of repeating pattern. And this is again, more architectural than illusionistic. And I think if we go back to this notion about Alberti, interestingly, he wrote about this notion of windows. And when he's talking about windows back then, he's not really talking about the windows we think about today, because a lot of the windows he's dealing with in real life in architecture didn't have glass in them. So he had all these prescriptions as to like what percentage of them you should cover and like what materials you should use in order to allow enough light in, but not too much heat to escape, all these kinds of practical realities. And so, these screen-like objects are kind of other kinds of windows, I guess. And these are these little icon pieces. I called the whole group icon one, or idol 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And they're about 24 by 19, 24 inches by 19 inches. And they're made from a drawing. And the drawing is then digitized. And then we make these complex cut patterns out of it, where every single point has an address. And then they're installed from a single point perspective. So there's a fixed position where your head has to be in order to install this so that all the pieces line up. And what's interesting about these works is that as you move around, the image fractures, but there's nobody else you can't really achieve that perfect moment again, that perfect single point perspective. So it's almost like an illustration of this kind of failing of Alberti's premise. And all these are made the same way. And again, it's all cut paper. So we're taking these designs and making digital cutting files to do this. This is a piece called The Lowest Common Denominator, and it's 54 by 46 inches. And it's a piece that actually, if you look online, you can see there's a video that the New York Times shot of me building it. And they really wanted a completed piece when they left, and we just couldn't give it to them. So if you watch the video, which is kind of a cool little video about how we build all the kite pieces, how all the paper is folded, all of that nuts and bolts stuff, they zoom in on this piece at the end, and it's significantly different than you see it here. But that's what happens when you're working on artificial deadlines. It's called The Functional Architecture of the Memory. There it is. And the flower pattern's done from a Sumi brush drawing. We have a little Albers reference in there too. The cool thing about the work too is like, because of the way it's built, you can kind of reference all of your heroes in the language of the work. So like if I want to tear something off of Murakami or like, steal something from Albers, you can do that, but by the time it kind of goes through the crucible of the studio, it comes out and you kind of have some ownership over it, or it becomes like a reference point that's clearly part of the body of work and not something where you're just imitating somebody else. So it allows you to kind of play with, invite your heroes to the party sometime. This shows also up at Rona Hoffman. We've had kind of a huge fall because we did Rona Hoffman, Roncini, and the University of Mississippi kind of all at the same time. This show is called Misunderstandings. These are kind of larger versions of those small pieces that we were just looking at. And these are installation views. And oftentimes I'll talk about how the work kind of references landscape, and it does. It's really fundamentally about landscape. And I think that it's not just like landscape, Courbet kind of landscape, but it's like, how do we build landscapes? And like, I think that the large works, I talked a little bit about like CGI, but those are definitely kind of like a certain kind of landscape. And these works also play with that sort of different landscape. Whoops. Did I just get, well, something just glitched on my computer, sorry. A different kind of landscape. And they employ different sorts of landscape perspectives. So for example, this piece has a much more traditional sort of horizon line-based landscape perspective. And all of these little pieces inside that make up the kind of bottom section are all made by my staff and me downstairs. So I don't make everything. And this piece also was employing that kind of more traditional landscape perspective. This is kind of a mandala space. And this has kind of a video game perspective, which for a long time I played a lot with these kind of video game iconography. I grew up playing video games. My dad used to take me to the arcade in the 80s to play like early vector video games. And so when we see these like star-shaped references, and this is a screen print actually, you know, they come from memories of things like this. This is a classic vector-based video game called Star Castle that I remember playing at the University Deli down the street from Idaho State University when I was a kid. This is another piece that's using that sort of perspective. And this piece, this is called Failed Attempts at Reconciliation. All of these pieces I've been showing you are about, you know, 32 by 27 inches. You can see how we get those star images, things like Stargate Defender. I actually had a Stargate Defender in my studio for a long time. This piece is called To Catch a Glimpse of the Sky 2021. There are 5 in this series. These are just 3 of them. They're 56 inches by 80 inches, and they're all 8 inches deep. And this is Missile Command, which is a super hard game. You know, there's 2 more images, and I think that we'll just end on this one. I have like 2 minutes left, I think. So, but I do want to say that a lot of what we talk about with Windows are how you frame the work looking back through a specific lens at a specific moment in time. And I think that, you know, when Anne Freeburg was writing her book in 2006 about Windows, she was just trying to understand how we were seeing the world through these new mechanisms and how we saw it historically. And I think that since she actually sadly passed away in 2012, and I think that it's a loss for all of us, because understanding kind of how she would see the growth of technology to today's, you know, standards would be really interesting. And I think that the way that I've been thinking about it more is less about Windows, really, as all of these things are like Windows on top of Windows on top of Windows, but more about layers. And I think that when we start thinking about things like printmaking that we see at the Palmer Museum, and the relationship of this work to printmaking, and how this work is different than printmaking, we enter into an interesting discussion, because we start talking about layers. And, you know, all of us today are dealing with layers in all aspects of our life. You know, we deal with Photoshop layers and, you know, just everything we can divide into layers. And it's the way that we see image and we see objects in how they're constructed. So like 3D modeling, for example, we're seeing objects and layers and layers and layers, because you can see all those striations. So what's nice about the artwork, though, is that even though we see those layers and we understand them, we have a relationship with them, we can actually peek around the side and we can see all the metadata, all the kind of stuff that informs the language on the surface, kind of buried behind it. And so it's this kind of like open equation where you can see all, it's like when you're in geometry, they're like, you know, show your work, and you can see, you can go through step by step by step in the proof to see everything that brought you to this point. And I think that there's a beauty and kind of honesty to the work through that, the system of their construction that kind of continues to reinvent itself in kind of the new context of the digital kind of world of language that we see around us today. So we'll just end there. Do we want to sit on an image?
Thanks so much, Jacob. Dazzling images. I have lots of questions, but I feel like I should let students start with this. So we have a couple of hands raised. So Dana, I don't know if we're able to go directly to those participants or if they should just perhaps put it in the Q&A. I'm not sure, but we also have another one question. I'll start with this question that is in the Q&A. In a larger piece like the Eclipse, do you compose as you go while up on the lift with the general overall shape in mind, or do you pre-plan the layout more precisely in your studio? How does process work for the more site-specific larger works?
That's a super good question. There aren't drawings. There's just like boxes of stuff. And so usually I walk into the space and there's just like, because it would take me as long to draw it as it would take to just build it. So there's a sense of like, well, you just start putting it up. And we start like with the Eclipse, we started in the back left-hand corner and did that section and then moved across the room. What I did know was that in earlier iterations of the piece, it came down in kind of a funnel shape to the middle of the room. And the middle of the room in this case is the altar of the church. And so if you stick this kind of funnel shape into the center of the church, there's a potential that you're going to have this thing feel very Nosferatu, you know, like it's going to feel like bats flying out of the pulpit, which really is something I didn't want to kind of have the work evoke. So that was kind of my only really consideration. It's like, well, how do we make this thing be respectful of the architecture and kind of do what it can possibly do in the space? And in that space, there's a real kind of, the architecture is so amazing that you really had to dance, the sculpture had to dance around it. And so it was kind of about discovering what we could do with it as we put it up. I think in other pieces like Gas Giant, you know, we started in the middle of the room on the first floor and just started building out and then made decisions as we went. And then we had staff back in New York still making parts for it. So we were actually building as we went and getting other shipments of pieces in as we were going. And so it allowed me to be like, oh, we need, you know, 500 more red squares or whatever. And then they would ship them out from New York when they were completed, and we could go back into the work and add those later. So it's a very organic process. It's very much like you open all the boxes and it's like having paints on a palette. You look at it, you're like, we better just put a mark down someplace, and then the next mark, and then the next mark, then the next mark.
There's a related question from another attendee who says, what is your creative process? So I think you did address some of that, but anything else you want to add about sort of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the creative process goes in a bunch of different directions. You know, there's the creative process that you use when you're making public artwork. There's a creative process that you're using kind of day to day in the studio. And then there's mistakes and experiments, you know, and I think that they overlap, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So oftentimes when, you know, I'm preparing to do, for example, Rona's show, you know, I knew that I wanted to make a series of pieces based on these kind of biometric, these biomorphic forms. And I wanted them to behave in certain kinds of ways. So I ended up doing the series of drawings. And then I wanted to populate the rest of the work with different language from different places that kind of reflected what's gone on in the last year. And so a lot of the patterns for the small pieces come from, you know, we built patterns over the last year out of different plagues and viruses and trees. And we went around like Brooklyn when it was deserted and took pictures of the same tree month after month after month for a whole year, and took those and turned them into separate patterns. So there's a combination of kind of like intuitive drawing and calculated sort of information from the world that is kind of then broken down and rebuilt into these more complicated patterns. So, you know, we'll do, you know, we also went through and did a whole bunch of patterns about buildings that were built during the time of plagues and famines. You know, this notion that society moves on and people are creative, and there's a larger will than kind of individual suffering a lot of the time. That is very, there is creation in the midst of misery. And so I was interested in that notion and how we could like look back at some of that stuff and build these kinds of textures out of them. And I think that it's kind of, I'm not sure that I expect you to get any of that stuff in the work, but it's a way of making, and a way of kind of making the work live in my mind as I'm making it, and make it relevant for me as, you know, where I know where certain patterns are coming from, and little inside jokes about where they're, you know, how they're juxtaposed.
I do have a question. You mentioned at the beginning that change is the only constant, right? This kind of idea. So can you just talk a little bit about editioning prints? So something like the prints that you did with Mixographia, which, you know, are they really mono prints? Is everyone slightly different? And can you also address the kind of fictive nature the trompe-l'oeil nature, because I will tell you, we actually thought these were collages when we first started working on them. And the Jordan Schnitzer folks kept saying, no, they're really, you need to see them in person, you know, and so we came away with a very different, anyway, that's a lot of questions thrown at you.
Firstly, the editions, you know, I think they're all, you know, if you have any intimacy with a print shop, they're all different. You know, it's like they're almost an illustration of the imperfection of human effort, you know, because they're so close to being exactly the same, but then you see the plates degrade, you see if you're really looking, you can just see how they're just all slightly different. And I think that, you know, and then when they go in the world and they're treated differently and they're framed differently and they sit on a wall in direct sunlight, then they keep changing. And so, you know, all of this stuff, once you release in the world, it's just constant change in different ways. You know, I think that you know, and then to the trompe-l'oeil issue with, or I guess effect evidenced in the mixographia pieces, you know, that's kind of what they specialize in that, not to this degree, but, you know, they work with Ed Ruscha. I think Ed Ruscha is probably where I got the idea to use the background board, but he had done a series of driftwood pieces with them that looked like a piece of driftwood just kind of emerging out of a sheet of paper. And so the way they do it is it's an intaglio print. So it's in a copper plate, but they're incredibly deep. And they hand ink the plates, and then they take handmade paper or pulp really, and press it in there. And then they take a mountain of blankets and run it through a press. So it crushes all that pulp into this hot copper plate that's been inked. And then as that paper, as we know from intaglio printing, contracts, it leaches the ink out, and then they pull it out and it looks just like the one on the wall, you know. So it's all done in one shot, and they make about one print a day. And so when Shia came to me to do a print, you know, I think part of what we talked about was, well, what's the point? You know, what's the point of our making a print together? And you know, he's a very interesting fellow, and so we had a lot of discussions about it. But I think that it came to the point where we were like, well, if I do this kind of work in the studio, we don't want to duplicate it. What can't we capture in the studio that we can capture through this language of print? Why is the print as a vehicle for communicating important? You know, those are the kinds of questions that we felt necessary to ask ourselves. And it came to a point of like, there's a lot of things that happen in the studio where we hang pieces on the wall. We have tangles of things that, you know, can never be duplicated. And what if we could freeze one of those moments of chaos? One of those moments that, you know, where you twist a string up and you make a knot. It wouldn't stay that way forever. You could never preserve it forever. So they become almost like three-dimensional. They become almost like snapshots. They're almost documentation, but they're not. There's someplace in between. And I think that they allowed me to kind of capture an energy and a kinetic quality, ironically enough, a kinetic quality in the print that you can't capture in like physical reality. So there's a sense of potential and then movement and tension that you can't make permanent in the studio as easily. And so I think those pieces, the pieces that you're showing, also the edition that we did afterwards, really get chaotic and knotted and messy in ways that the work coming out of my studio isn't, because it's much more considered and it's much more engineered. So it allowed me to have a lot more fun with that stuff. Also with the Durham prints, the other prints that we did, we play a lot with gravity and the fact that we want things to defy rules of physics in ways that they can't in the work coming out of the studio. So kind of undermining physical limitation is a big goal.
Thank you. We have a question from Chang, and if anybody else wants to put a final question, and after that, we should probably then let Jacob go. It's been a really wonderful hour, but Chang is our guest curator of the exhibition, and she says, what a visual feast, mind-blowing works. One of the consistently impressive things I saw from your work, starting from perennial to the present, is that they look surprisingly different from different angles. It's like a different work and keeps on getting richer. Do you surprise yourself in the making process, or do you map out all the perspectives in advance using 3D modeling? Also, I totally see that there's an optimal viewing point for your work, but do you think there's an optimal trajectory for viewers to experience your large installations? Do you nudge them into such a trajectory?
Well, I don't agree with the optimal that there's an optimal viewing point for the wall works either. I think what I was trying to point out about them is while they're made from a fixed position, we have to abandon that fixed position almost immediately, and because their life is in that imperfection, right? That idea that your body knows that there's a perfect point where your eye can rest, where everything lines up, but you can't achieve it, and so it's always slightly wrong, and that kind of it goes to the notion of the addition. It's like they're close enough to the same that we can see difference in them, and difference becomes the important thing, or difference becomes a noticeable thing. So when we know that there's a perfect point of perspective and we can't achieve it, that kind of inability to achieve it is part of where the action is in terms of the meaning of the work, right? How it lives. And I think that with the installations, a lot of what happened, especially because most of the work started with installation, and those installations were so big that you were never outside them. So you could see a chunk of it when you walked into the gallery, but by the time you were in the room with it, it was above you and beside you, and and in front of you, and your kind of personal relationship with it was always the most important place to be viewing it from. It was just as good as anybody else's. And what was kind of cool about the work when I first started making it was this kind of realization that, especially coming from painting, where you go to like the Art Institute of Chicago, and paintings are hung at a very specific fixed center point. That's not every it's a single point perspective. It's like, this is where it's going to look best. We're going to hang it at this center point. And it's not a super democratic way of, doesn't make the painting super democratic in the way that you interact with them. Like kids, you always have seen parents holding their kids up in front of the Degas or whatever. And I think that this solves some of that problem, because like when you see kids or like babies or toddlers come in and interact with this work, their experience is absolutely as valid as yours. Their viewpoint is absolutely as rich and as rewarding as yours is. And I think that there's, that was a kind of a happy accident when I started making this work, kind of that discovery. And I remember that first piece that we did, the first Infinite Expansive Sky piece that I had at Ann Nathan Gallery, was up there for like a couple months. And I showed up to work one day and there was this junior high class, like, or middle school class, taking their picture underneath it, and I was like, I was so amazed, because it's like, kids when they're in middle school are just like monsters. They have they have like all the language skills of an adult, but none of the kind of emotional maturity to deploy them. So like the fact that they could all get together and have a good time with this, and I felt like the generosity of it was there. I felt like the scale of it wasn't intimidating. The language was open, and I felt like it really succeeded, because there isn't a, for a lot of reasons, but one of which isn't that there isn't a fixed sort of like intimidating distance perspective you have on it. You don't have to worry about walking up to it, because you're already in it by the time you experience it.
I think it's interesting because your experience being a preparator for the gallery in Chicago, I can see that in your work, is like you're not daunted by all of this crazy installation. At the same time, it sounds like you're fighting back against the kind of the hanging point and the sort of neat edges that preparators strive for. So that's interesting.
Preparators are amazing, but there's some real uptight people out there. So what we have to do, like when we go to museums especially, is like make sure that we have a lot of people who aren't preparators. So for example, when we were at MoCA, we had 3 preparators. We had 6 people from my studio, and then the other people were like musicians that one of my friends found. Like one of the guys was in Deerhoof. He had all these. And Hannah Greeley, the artist, she also came over and helped out. And so then they brought like a mountain of chaos to the whole thing. And so we actually, part of what I do when we're doing those large scale pieces too, is because I'm controlling a bunch of people at the same time. You have to quickly understand what they're doing and how their minds work, and like what they're uptight about and what they're not uptight about, and rotate them in and out of different sections of the piece. So especially when you're working these organic, flowing sort of canopies, if it's too regular, it's stifling to the piece. But if it's regular and then just madness and then regular again, then there's something happening that's kind of interesting. But you have to do that when you're working at the scale. You have to be like, you have to understand how that's happening, who can work on that, and what their voice means. And a lot of that, because we work I work with kind of a chorus of voices here in the studio is second nature now, but it's really important how those big pieces function.
Well, just interesting, there's a related question. Actually, we have two questions left that I hope we can get to, but Stephen says, your work is so compelling. Much of your day must involve project management and personnel coordination. How do you stay connected to the intention that drives your art?
Well, thanks for that observation, Stephen. Because it's a huge amount of coordination. I think there's a couple things. One, we kind of lead assistant who's been with me for a really long time. We've known each other since I think we met in Chicago when we were both still students. And he's an incredibly good artist. So I lean on him quite a bit around for project management around here. The other thing is the project management for the public artwork became so difficult that ultimately a couple of years ago, I spun off a second company to do it. So one of my friends is Via Selman, the painter's kind of main assistant. And he's been working for her for years. And he is an incredibly good art installer. So I used to take him from her and on these big jobs, like he did Governor's Island, for example, with us. And we would, and then another guy who does the 3D modeling for public artworks is a Columbia trained architect. And so I made a partnership with them to do public artwork for the studio so that we didn't have to do the project management on it. So they're the people who did PDX, for example. They're doing the Stanford Graduate School of Education, the US Embassy in Namibia, a couple of building projects here in the city. So all that kind of large scale public artwork is now being handled by this other company. So I have an architect who deals with structural engineer. I have Jameson who deals with, production and like dealing with all the small parts manufacturers. The two of them, will go ahead and design pieces of hardware and they'll bring them to me and we'll be like, which of these three is working, and then we'll redesign it and I'll go back and Jameson will find somebody to make it, and then cost engineer everything, all that tedious stuff. I kind of pushed onto these guys, and now my job in that work is just to do the design work and to kind of bring more chaos to the system. Because what happens is that there's this, when you're working in the studio, you want to make mistakes. Like you want to have the freedom to kind of experiment, to kind of create messes, to fail. And I think it's such a fundamental part of kind of a healthy studio practice is to have failure built in to part of your day. And so you should fail a few times a day if you're doing it right. And if you're making public artwork, you get sued if you fail. So there's this kind of division that you have to have if you're doing both at the same time in the same space. It's really, really difficult to handle. And I got to a point where I felt like the public artwork was hurting me, like creatively, because it was making me more conservative. It was making me make decisions that weren't as healthy and interesting for the artwork. And it didn't allow me to make mistakes because, the liability was gigantic. If you have like, 10,000 pound sculpture fall on somebody, it's not a good day. So, so now that's, I guess in summation, the way the studio is set up now is that this is really a laboratory. We make a lot of mistakes, and the public artwork tries not to make mistakes. and a lot of that is I can actually bring them crazier ideas than I would normally bring to myself and be like, can we make this happen? Because it's their job to figure out if they can make it safe and make it architecturally feasible. And I don't have to be the architect and engineer and go and do all those parts.
Right. So you can remain close to the fun part, the idea, the artistic part, right?
I mean, because the whole thing is that the studio should be an idea factory, right? And the more you're just producing architecture, it's just hard. I mean, architects to innovate as an architect is just an impossibly difficult thing to imagine, and people do it, which is amazing.
One last question from Saskia, and this relates to the idea of ideas and where they come from. And she says, you mentioned sometimes being inspired by writers and books. Have you referenced any of Italo Calvino's writings?
Oh yeah, I spent a lot of time with Calvino. A long time ago though. Of course, Invisible Cities is the book that everybody reads, but all those books are interesting. I think that the one thing about Calvino that I cherish is that I think that because I read a bunch of like the cosmic comics and all of that stuff, by the time I got done with it, I had kind of an open mind to other sorts of rewriting of fable. And so then I got really interested in like people who are rewriting fables. And I ended up reading Robert Coover. And he wrote this kind of an incredible book called Songs and Deskins. I have like, and there are these kind of pervy like takes on fairy tales. But for a number of years, I was taking like a lot of titles from those books. So if you read that book, you'll start seeing the titles of my pieces showing up in chunks of sentences here and chunks of sentences there. And a lot of the reading that I'm doing, you know, the stuff that I'm actually reading is stuff that I'm interested in the way that people are writing, how they're using language, how they're, you know, how their prose is evocative and poetic, and things that are not necessarily prose based in terms of the writer's focus. I tend to listen to on tape, sadly enough, but there's a lot of reasons to read prose because prose are interesting. It's interesting to see how people craft worlds out of them. And Coover is one of those people that does it really, really well.
Your titles make a lot more sense to me now. Some of the prints have
yeah,
very long titles.
They are pretty crazy. Well, now I just kind of generate them too. So, but part of the thing with titles was for a long time, I didn't title anything. So like perennial was like a really unusual thing that I put a title on a piece that old. Most things were untitled. And so the titles came in much later when I was just like, I felt like people were assuming they knew what was happening with the work. So there's this idea when you make something that's really beautiful, right? Like a really decorative, or really Baroque, or really Rococo, that people show up and they're like, oh, this means this, you know, this guy's into meditation, you know, or this is about, you know, bucolic and landscape. It's so pretty. And if you've got this incredibly beautiful picture and you put just an incredibly violent title next to it, people stop, you know, they stop just a second longer and they're like, what does that mean? You know, and so it brings you back into the work in a way that you might not have seen, you know, it's a door that you might not have seen possible to enter into the work, which I think the more I've started putting titles on it, the more I could feel people engaging with the work in ways that were interesting. And the titles aren't about defining your experience with the work. They're more about encouraging you to bring your own curiosity to the work, because a lot of what happens is that when people are curious, when you can make people be curious, the artwork has this much richer life on its own, right? People are engaging with it. They're thinking about it. They're like, why did they make this decision? Why did they do this? What does this mean? Is this narrative? Is this about, you know, so there's the questions. Once you start the question factory, it's, you know, there's all kinds of possibility. But if people think they know what's happening with the work, then they just walk by. So it's like game over.
Well, on behalf of the curators and registrars of the world, I thank you for titling your works. It makes our jobs somewhat easier. And I will say to folks out there, if you have not come and seen the exhibition, please do, and come engage with these works. You can't just walk past them. And they will make you think, and they are remarkable. And Jacob, this talk has been terrific. And I'm just so delighted that you were able to spend time with us today. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thanks for everybody. Thanks everybody. I mean.